Do I have? No, let's take one last call. Okay, it's going to be a short one.
Okay.
This is Jamie, him from the Lone Star State of Texas. And the question here is, how do you respond to transgender people should have their own sports leagues? You're on the air with Katy Montgomerie and Johnny P.
Hey guys, thanks for taking my call.
Hey.
Yeah, I was in a conversation with some oppos, and I'm of course very much a trans rights ally. And someone said, "Well, I don't mind them playing sports, but they should have their own league. Why don't they? Why should they? Why should they be trying to get into the other leagues? Why can't they have their own league?" And other than the spluttering disgust, I couldn't come up with a cogent counter argument in the moment.
It's fair,
right? I think so when we're talking about like separate leagues for things, I think one of the things I always think of is how there's a women's chess league, and obviously women aren't any less or more smart than men, and it's not a physical game. So what's the point in having a women's chess league? You could say it's some relic of the past where women were considered less intelligent or whatever, but that's just totally garbage. Obviously that's not the case. But it is still a useful league, and so we could, and the reason for that is because misogyny is a big factor in people's performance for various sports and games. And there's studies that show this, and shows that women perform worse when they think they're playing against men than when they think they're playing against women. And you can do this quite easy with chess, because you can score games very easily, and you can anonymize the players. And there's a few really good YouTube videos about this, which is really interesting. But it's why they have in chess like an open league and then a women's league. So in that case, sometimes separate leagues are a good thing, but it would be bad if women were forced to only compete in the women's league, because then what would happen is what we see in things like football, where the women's sport is just as competitive, just as exciting, just as talented as the men's sport, but it gets massively underfunded and people don't pay attention to it, and women footballers are just considered worse because of misogyny. So we'd have that kind of difficulty, and in games where there aren't physical differences playing a role, then it's bad to segregate people, because segregation itself can cause an issue, like I was just explaining with football. So when we look at trans people in sports, we could say, maybe trans people should have their own leagues. And the first question is, are you saying trans people should have to be mandated to do their own leagues, or are you saying optional? And if it's optional, then that could be good, because it could be a situation where trans people get to go and play sport with each other without having to face against transphobia. Go play football with your friends, and maybe you could have enough people to have two teams and play against each other, and it might be fun. And I know that in the UK, there is a all trans football team, and they all play together and stuff. So for combating transphobia and stuff, that's good. But the issue then is, to have a game of football, you need, I guess you can maybe do 5 a side, I think. I'm not really not knowledgeable about football, but to do a big full game of football, you need 22 people. Are there 22 trans people who want to play football in the nearby area? In the UK, there are. But maybe if we pick another sport like rugby, you need more people. Are there how many, 30, or how many you need for a full rugby game? Or maybe volleyball or ice hockey? Are there enough people in the UK or even worldwide to play a game of all trans ice hockey? And then if there are, is there just one trans league? Or is there, obviously some trans people are going to be the top of their game, and others are just going to be amateurs. So maybe we need to divide it up, and we end up in this situation like we saw recently. I think it was Utah. The governor actually vetoed their trans bill, which was to ban trans kids from playing sports. And the reason was, he was this only affects one child in the entire state. So if there's only one child in the entire state trying to play sports, and you're let's do our own leagues, who are they going to play against? Absolutely no one. There's no one who they can play against, and it's an effective ban of them. So we end up with a situation where if we have these mandatory forced leagues, then firstly, no one's going to watch it. No one's going to watch the trans sports league, because there won't be many people in it, and it'll be even more prejudiced against in the women's sports leagues for lots of things. And then who are they going to play against? We're not even going to have enough teams, and then the difficulty is going to be spread. But then also the whole point in this argument is people talking about sexual dimorphism and the difference in ability for certain sports, often strength-based sports. And like, even if you make the false claim that trans people are their birth sex and they fit in the averages there for sporting performance, which is just false. If that's the case, then what you're saying, you want just trans men and trans women, non-binary people all to play together? Or do you need 2 separate trans sports leagues or 3 separate trans sports leagues? Or if you then accept the reality that transition changes people's performance, and especially when we're talking about trans people who transition at different ages. So we're going to have trans men who transitioned before puberty, during puberty, after puberty, and in later life, and then trans women who did the same. And each of those are going to, like, if you haven't gone through male puberty, then you cannot have a male puberty advantage. And so then we're going to say there's this like percentage of a percentage of trans women who now have to have their own sporting league, where their performance is basically the same as cis women for most sports, but not necessarily all of them, depending on what we're looking at. And we want them to have their own. It's just a ban. It's the same as a ban for lots of these things. Or you're saying, I don't care about any of the things that I claim to care about when it comes to trans people. Like women, if you've got this argument, they always do an argument in rugby. It's not safe for trans women to play with cis women. And then you're like, oh, well, all trans people have to play together. It's like, what? So trans women are safe to play against trans men and other trans women, but not like it's something like, I don't care. And all it is, the argument here is just, I don't like it, get rid of them. It's just a segregation argument. It's I want to solve all my problems by just pushing it out the way. So if I was arguing, sorry, Johnny, I'm doing a monologue.
No.
You can cut in a sec. If you want to argue against this position, I mean, the reality is when we're picking sports categories, the overall goal should be to include as many people as we possibly can, but with the caveat of we still want it to be fair and competitive. Otherwise, people won't want to compete. And in some cases, that means that we need separate categories for men and women. And in some cases, that means we need separate weight classes as well. And the first thing we need to do in order to decide whether we need separate categories for men and women or separate weight classes or other separate classes based on physical attributes is to do some science and see if it's important. I mean, if you were trying to argue that we need weight classes for chess, everyone would be like, what are you talking about? Weight isn't a factor in chess. It's just ridiculous. So we need to do the science on this, and we need to say, well, which groups of trans people are you claiming have an unfair advantage? Do we have any evidence for this? Does it apply to the sport we're actually discussing? And that's when we should decide whether we have categories. And if your goal is to have as many people as possible playing the sport, which should be any good faith person's goal, even if we did a load of science and we said, oh, all trans women are unfair to play football, then my position would be, well, we still should try and include everyone. So that might mean at grassroots level, it's not so important. And then as it gets more competitive, maybe we do need a separate trans league. But if we do, we need to have these restrictions on it. And maybe it's open to cis people who want to play or whatever. If they're not doing any of that, then it's just a poor argument. But I think if you just say the response to someone is, well, let's do the science and see what is fair. And you will find that blanket bans never are justified. Never makes any sense.
If I may,
bit of a ramble there.
No, you're good. Johnny, it's all good stuff. I like to. One correction I'd like to make, Katie, is that you said do a load of science. I believe the proper Montgomerieism is do a science. Is I believe the correct way of saying
it. You need to do a science.
You need to do a science. But before I weigh in on this, I want to hear from our caller, please. Jamie, what were your thoughts to what Katie said?
I mean, yes, the ideal, as far as I can see, is basically like all sports at the professional level should come down to a gender agnostic set of physical requirements, or even disability agnostic set of physical requirements. Though he turned out to be a monster, letting Oscar Pistorius race in the real Olympics, the able-bodied Olympics, was a step forward. And I think that the model for sports, even at the highest echelon, should be: this is what is fair and competitive, and as long as you meet these criteria, regardless of what your birth sex was, what your chromosomes are, etc., you can compete. if it's a physical thing, of course, sports like snooker or darts or chess or anything.
It is still worth.
Yes.
It is still worth acknowledging how sporting performance has a lot of factors in it, and people always think of strength and skill because they're the things we are kind of wanting to test with sports. But money is like one of the biggest determining factors in sporting achievement.
Yeah.
And another one is prejudice. Trans people aren't going to get the same shot at sports because they face prejudice like on the field, off the field, in terms of funding, in terms of being able to be rich enough to do the sport, to buy the equipment, to take the time off work, all these other things. So if we were to just agnostically say, oh, we'll just have the categories like this, I think it would still be important to acknowledge how women's sport is underfunded, and perhaps having women's leagues would still be a good idea in some sense to get funding much better. It should be much better than it is today. Yeah, so it's just a fact of
equality and justice rather than quote unquote fairness. There's so many people that hide behind, oh well, we just got to be fair, everyone has to have the same opportunity. No, because some people start at a much higher disadvantage. Same with race and all kinds of stuff.
Also, if it was fair, then we would draw every thing and be boring.
Sports scientists, sports doctors, and what have you, they are dealing with this issue. There are standards that do allow transgender people to compete in the categories of their gender, right? We've seen that, and of course, the shitlords online jump on it and go in the attack mode. How ridiculous it is! They do that kind of stuff, but the people who are tasked with figuring out the science of this are working through this. Do they have the answers that will put a pin in it and it's done? Absolutely not. Are they working toward it? I think they are. And is politics a factor in all of that? Yes. In fact, us talking about it is great, right? But the scientists are doing a science on it. They're doing it constantly. And unless we are well-versed in their methodology and their conclusions, it becomes a political conversation. And so your friends who are, I'm assuming, weighing in on a political, or the people that you talk to about this, are weighing in on a political, I would probably argue, I'm going to guess, an uninformed political position. And I think that while it's great to have political positions, and you can't help but have them, it needs to be informed by expertise in this. And so that might be where you can take that conversation, looking at the science. There are things that are known. There are things that are known. There are things that are unknown, and then there are unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And as we go down that path, there will be fewer unknowns, both known and unknown, that will help us inform how we should employ policy. But I can tell you, states, the IOC, NCAA, high schools, they all have different standards for this stuff. And it's based in science, and some of it is based in politics. So that's where I would go, is looking at that. It's not perfect.
I think Johnny's point here is good. And I actually think that I learned that this from this show, watching it before I was a host, was someone called in and challenged, two atheists, and they're like, oh yeah, well, what about this evolution thing? What about this archaeology thing? And they were like, well, are you an expert? Because neither of us two are experts. And they were like, well, no, of course I'm not an expert. They're like, have you got like some kind of research grant in this or a PhD? And they were like, no. They're like, so what's your qualifications here? And they're like, well, nothing. I got this off Google or something. Yeah. And okay, you're allowed an opinion, but your opinion is literally worthless. Like, my opinion on football is worthless. I don't even know the rules, or soccer for everyone else watching. But like, so when someone says this, oh, trans people should have their own league, I often say, well, what do you know about sports science? And what do you even know about medical transition? Can you even tell me what medical transition does? Do you know what epigenetics is? And they'll be like, well, no, not really. And like, well, what qualifications do you have here? So why are you giving your opinion on this? Like, it's okay as a pub discussion, but like, if you're saying to remove people's rights and ability to live their lives, who are you?
It's a bit of a dead end.
Fuck off.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a dead end because it's like a bunch of people sitting really exactly a pub conversation, right? But you're not getting anywhere with it. It's like the old game. You ever played that when you before the internet, before smartphones, you'd sit around a table and you'd be like, yeah, well, I read that this was the case. Oh, I think that this is and you never get anywhere because it's just a bunch of people pulling out of their asses, right? Whereas now you can look it up. Oh, wait, I was wrong, right? Eddie Furlong was the guy in Terminator 2. It's not Leonardo DiCaprio. I lost a toy lightsaber to that bet. I wouldn't have had to lose it in college if I had had the internet with me. So you can engage in that conversation and realize that you're not solving the world's problems. But I think the better tactic is what we're discussing here, which is like, what have you read? What's the science? Show me the science. What is the source of the science? Are you getting it from the Family Research Council? Are you getting it from the IOC or something like that?
Yeah.
And why would the Family Research Council not be as good as the IOC?
Well, that's what I countered with at the end of the conversation. I said, right, fine, I'll look it up. And I actually looked up an article stating that latest research says that it takes about a year of full medical transition for it to be considered, like the transition is sort of complete enough to be considered a biological change. And the IOC has rules on this. But it was kind of like a frustrated, almost like a desperation move to sort of just go, fine, screw it, I'll do the research then.
If you want to, because often like the point in these arguments for them is to just say something dumb and then keep saying it until you give up or be frustrated. I think sometimes it's good to have some knowledge of in my mind, it's like the dunks. If you can reveal someone's position is irrational or contradictory or stands on an assumption that they haven't even considered and is false, then you can at least get to a point where they have to do what you had to do, where they have to concede to go and look something up. And just because I got a chance being, thousands of people listening to stuff, when someone talks about trans people in sports, they are talking about trans women in sports. They're not talking about trans people. And when they're doing it, they're talking about, they want to just do a blanket ban. They're like, oh, trans women are just men, they should be banned. That's their argument. That's as far as they've ever considered it. Mm-hmm. And you could go in and be like, oh, well, what sport are we talking about? And what's the muscle strength? Like, that's the like head-on argument in, and that's where you end up just having to concede to experts. But there are some very obvious holes in their original, like in the position that they're taking. For example, is they're saying that male puberty gives you an unfair advantage in sport. We can just put that to one side for a second, because not all trans women go through male puberty. So when someone says that, you can be like, well, you're proposing a blanket ban here, but you must concede that a blanket ban would ban trans women who transitioned before puberty and who never went through male puberty and now have effectively gone through female puberty. So what is your claim here? How do they have an unfair advantage? What's your argument here? And they'll be like, oh, well, I'm not talking about them. And you're like, well, okay, but that means a blanket ban, like your original claim, a blanket ban is false, right? Can you agree on that? And they'll, either they'll change the subject or, I've done this a lot. Sometimes they concede, okay, I'm not talking about them, I'm talking about everyone else. You go, okay, cool. So what about people who started transitioning 6 months into puberty? Where's the line? How do we test this? When someone turns up to a sporting organization and says, I transitioned at 14, how do you know? Then suddenly they haven't, none of them have considered this. No one pushing for a blanket ban has even spent 5 minutes thinking about this. Their entire argument is they are men, therefore it's bad. Yeah. And as soon as you've got in underneath one of their assumptions and made them realize they know fucking nothing, then it's much easier to say, well, are you an expert? Like, how you haven't even considered some of the basic parameters of this discussion. So maybe come back when you've spent 5 minutes thinking about it.
Yeah.
I could rant on this all day.
Yeah. There's a lot to say. I would say this, and I muted you, not because I don't think you have something to say, Jamie, but we have to move on. We just have to. Is that notice that in order to actually have a well-articulated position on this, you have to stop the posturing in that conversation, and you have to listen to a lot of questions where there will not be immediate answers available at the tip of your tongue and the top of your head. And so that's why those conversations are so difficult, that it does require a structure to the conversation and ultimately that's I think is when people get so fixated on this issue, it is a proxy for a larger discomfort that people have
Absolutely.
with transgender people. Because honestly, it's said before, they may be interesting questions to have, and there may be some like finer points, right, in this subject. But the truth is, generally speaking, those same people that have such a stake in this don't give a flying shit about women's sports. They don't watch it. They care about it to the extent that their daughters are in the sports, right? And if they don't have a daughter in a particular sport, they couldn't care less, except on some conceptual thing. But notice that they are not talking about a lot of other issues that they could talk about from some high concept social good kind of an issue. They're focused on this because they're told to focus on this because the media is covering this issue. That said, this is an important issue. It may not affect billions of people, but it affects many people, and the experts are working on it, and we need to stay up on the science and realize that when a person's talking about this, they might be talking about this plus this whole other huge thing that may be fit into the category of gender critical politics.